The plane was a Piper Saratoga. Single engine. 6 seats. White with blue trim. John had owned it for 3 months. Friday night, July 16, 1999. Essex County Airport in New Jersey sat quiet under a sky that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Clear enough to see stars in patches. Thick enough that the horizon had started disappearing into gray nothing. John walked the tarmac doing his pre-flight check. 38 years old, brown hair catching the last of the daylight. He moved with the careful attention of someone who'd been taught that shortcuts kill. Flaps, fuel, control surfaces. Everything by the book because the book was written in other people's blood. His wife Carolyn stood near the hangar with her sister Lauren. Both blonde. Both wearing summer dresses that moved in the breeze coming off the water. They were headed to Martha's Vineyard for a wedding. Rory was getting married. John's cousin. The last of that generation to tie the knot, and everyone who mattered would be there. Carolyn had her arms crossed, not angry, just the way she stood when she was thinking about something she didn't want to say out loud. Lauren checked her watch. They were running late. Not dangerously late. Just late enough that the sun would be completely gone before they reached cruising altitude. John had 400 hours of flight time. Not a lot. Not a little. Enough that he knew what he didn't know. He'd passed his instrument rating test 2 months earlier, but the certificate hadn't arrived yet. Technically, he could fly in cloud. Legally, he couldn't. The distinction mattered to the FAA. It mattered less to physics. The forecast had called for scattered clouds. Visibility 5 miles. Winds light and variable. Standard summer evening on the northeastern coast. Nothing that should stop a flight. Nothing that would make an experienced pilot think twice. But John wasn't experienced. Not really. He was competent. There's a difference. Competent pilots follow procedures. Experienced pilots know when procedures aren't enough. He finished the walk-around and waved them over. Carolyn climbed into the right seat. Lauren took the middle row. The cabin smelled like leather and aviation fuel, and the coconut sunscreen Carolyn always wore. John ran through the engine start checklist. Mixture rich. Throttle cracked. Master switch on. The propeller turned once, twice, then caught with a sound like tearing fabric. Tower cleared him for departure at 8:38 p.m. Still enough light to see the runway clearly. Still enough definition between earth and sky to know which way was up. He advanced the throttle, and the Piper accelerated down the center line. 50 knots, 60, 75. Rotate. The wheels left pavement and New Jersey dropped away beneath them. They climbed to 5,500 feet heading northeast over water. Long Island Sound spread out below them like hammered pewter. Towns along the coast glowed yellow and orange. Streetlights, house lights. The organized constellations of human habitation that told you where the ground was even when you couldn't see it. John contacted approach control. His voice on the radio sounded calm, professional. He gave his position and altitude and intentions. The controller acknowledged. Standard traffic advisories followed. Everything normal. Everything routine. Carolyn said something. John laughed. Lauren leaned forward between the seats to look at the lights below. Just 3 people going to a wedding. Just a short flight on a summer evening. Just another entry in the logbook that every pilot keeps. At 9:26 p.m., John made his last radio call. He reported his position 12 miles west of Martha's Vineyard. Descending for landing. The controller acknowledged. After that there was silence. Not the silence of radio procedure. Not the silence of frequency changes or switched-off transponders. The silence of something that had stopped existing in the place where it was supposed to be. The plane never arrived. The wedding guests waited. Rory checked her watch every few minutes. Someone called the airport. No one had seen them land. Someone else called the house on the vineyard. No answer. The kind of no answer that makes your stomach drop because you know something has gone wrong in a way that can't be fixed. By midnight, the Coast Guard had boats in the water. By dawn, they had helicopters in the air. By the time the sun came up on Saturday morning, the entire apparatus of federal emergency response had mobilized to find 3 people who had simply vanished somewhere between New Jersey and Massachusetts. But that would come later. In the moments before 9:26, before the last radio call, before the silence, there were just 3 people in a small plane flying over dark water toward lights they would never reach. The wedding reception at the vineyard went quiet around 11 p.m. when someone noticed the empty seats. 3 empty seats at a table near the front where John and Carolyn and Lauren were supposed to be sitting. Rory kept glancing at the door, kept checking her phone, kept telling herself there was traffic or a delay or some perfectly reasonable explanation that didn't involve the word crash. By 11:30, the reasonable explanations had run out. Someone called John's apartment in Manhattan. No answer. Someone else called the airport in New Jersey where the plane had departed. The woman who answered said yes, they'd taken off. Yes, the flight plan was filed for Martha's Vineyard. No, she didn't know why they hadn't arrived. Her voice had that careful, neutral tone people use when they're trying not to say the thing everyone's already thinking. At 11:47, a call went to the Coast Guard station in Woods Hole. Missing aircraft, 3 souls on board, last known position 12 miles west of the island. The officer who took the call wrote down the details and felt his chest tighten because 12 miles west meant open water, and open water at night meant bodies not survivors, if you were being honest about probabilities. The first boat left the dock at 12:15 a.m. A 47-foot motor lifeboat with a crew of 4 and searchlights that could punch through fog at half a mile. The ocean was calm, almost flat. The kind of calm that should make finding wreckage easy if there was wreckage to find. The beam swept back and forth across black water that gave nothing back. No debris, no oil slick, no emergency beacon screaming its location to satellites overhead. By 1 a.m., there were 3 boats searching. By 2 a.m., there were 6. By the time the sun came up on Saturday morning, there were helicopters from the Coast Guard and the Air National Guard and the Navy all flying grid patterns over a search area that kept expanding because no one knew exactly where to look. The ocean is big. Planes are small. The math doesn't favor finding things, but this wasn't just any plane. This wasn't just any 3 people. This was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Jr., son of the 35th president, the boy who saluted his father's coffin in 1963, the man who'd spent his entire life being America's prince, whether he wanted the job or not. This was the kind of missing person case that gets resources most families never see. The kind that makes admirals pick up phones at 4 in the morning and redirect ships that were supposed to be doing other things. By Saturday afternoon, the search area covered over 300 square miles. Coast Guard cutters, Navy destroyers, Air Force C-130 cargo planes with sensing equipment that could detect a floating soda can from 10,000 feet. The Pentagon had committed assets usually reserved for combat operations. Someone high up had made a decision that finding these 3 people mattered more than whatever exercises or patrols those assets were supposed to be doing. The media arrived in waves. Local news crews first, then the national networks, then the international press. Satellite trucks lined up along the docks in Woods Hole and Hyannisport. Reporters did stand-ups with the ocean in the background talking about the search effort and the Kennedy family and the terrible possibility that America's golden boy had died the same way his father did, suddenly and violently, and far too young. But the official statements were careful, measured. Coast Guard spokesmen talked about search protocols and weather conditions and the professionalism of the crews involved. They didn't use the word bodies. They didn't use the word recovery. They stuck to search and rescue even though everyone watching knew that after 24 hours in 68-degree water, the rescue part was wishful thinking. The NTSB arrived Saturday evening. National Transportation Safety Board. The people who investigate when planes fall from the sky. They set up operations in a hangar at the Vineyard Airport, brought computers and charts and experts in aerodynamics and human factors and all the technical disciplines that go into figuring out why aluminum and fuel and 3 human beings ended up scattered across the ocean floor instead of landing safely on a runway. The lead investigator was a man named Robert Pierce, 53 years old, 26 years with the NTSB. He'd worked the crash of Flight 800 off Long Island 3 years earlier, knew how to handle high-profile accidents where the world was watching, and the pressure to find answers came from the very top of the government. He stood in that hangar and looked at the maps showing where the search was concentrated, and thought about all the things that could make a plane disappear: mechanical failure, pilot error, weather, sabotage. The list wasn't long, but each item on it led to a different kind of investigation with different kinds of questions. By Sunday morning, pieces had started washing ashore. A seat cushion on Philbin Beach, part of a luggage door near Gay Head. Small fragments of what had been a complete airplane 48 hours earlier. The debris field suggested impact. High-speed impact. The kind where the plane hit water going fast enough that the water might as well have been concrete. The kind where the people inside didn't have time to be afraid, because the physics of deceleration turned organs into soup before pain signals could reach the brain. Divers went down Monday afternoon. Navy divers in dry suits with underwater lights and cameras and the training to work in zero visibility when all you can do is feel your way through wreckage by touch. They found the main fuselage section in 120 feet of water. Found the engine still attached to the firewall. Found seats and luggage and personal items scattered across a debris field roughly 200 feet long. Found 3 bodies still strapped into their seats because the seat belts had held even when everything else failed. The bodies came up Tuesday morning. Black bags on stretchers carried to waiting ambulances that drove to the medical examiner's office in Pocasset. Positive identification came through dental records. John, Carolyn, Lauren. The 3 people who'd climbed into a plane on Friday night were now 3 sets of remains waiting to be released to family for burial. The Kennedy family released a statement Tuesday afternoon. Brief, dignified. The kind of statement you make when grief is private but death is public. They thanked the Coast Guard and the Navy and all the searchers who'd worked around the clock. They asked for privacy. They didn't ask questions about why the search had involved so many federal resources so quickly. They didn't ask why the NTSB had moved with unusual speed. They didn't ask because asking wouldn't bring anyone back, and because the Kennedys had learned a long time ago that some questions don't have answers that make the pain any less. But other people were asking. Pilots were asking. Aviation experts were asking. People who knew John and knew his training and knew that he wasn't the kind of pilot who took stupid risks were asking how this could have happened on a clear summer evening over water he'd flown dozens of times before. The official investigation had barely started, and already the official answers weren't sitting right with people who understood what it takes to make a plane fall from the sky. The NTSB preliminary report came out 6 days after the crash. 8 pages. Dry technical language describing wreckage distribution and impact signatures and the condition of recovered components. The conclusion section was brief. Probable cause: spatial disorientation. The pilot had become confused about the aircraft's orientation in flight, had lost the horizon, had entered what pilots call a graveyard spiral, without realizing it until the ocean came up and erased everything. Spatial disorientation kills pilots every year. It's basic human biology working against basic physics. Your inner ear lies to you when you can't see the ground. tells you the plane is straight and level when it's actually banking 30 degrees and descending 1,000 feet per minute. Your instruments tell the truth, but trusting instruments over your body's sensation requires training and discipline and hours of practice that become muscle memory. John had the training, had passed the instrument-written exam, had flown with instructors in simulated conditions, but he didn't have the hours, didn't have the experience that turns knowledge into instinct. The report noted that weather conditions had deteriorated after takeoff. Visibility had dropped below VFR minimums, visual flight rules minimums, the rules that say if you can't see 3 miles and stay clear of clouds, you shouldn't be flying unless you're rated and current for instruments. John was rated on paper, wasn't current in practice. The instructor who'd prepared him for the test said he was cautious, methodical, always asked questions when he wasn't sure. Not the profile of a pilot who'd deliberately fly into conditions beyond his skill level. But the wreckage told a different story. The impact angle suggested a steep descending turn. 45 degrees nose down. 60 degrees of bank. Speed well above normal cruise. The kind of attitude that develops when a pilot loses situational awareness and doesn't recognize the emergency until it's too late to recover. The Piper had hit the water at close to 200 miles per hour, broke apart on impact. The G-forces exceeded anything the human body could survive. Death would have been instantaneous for all 3 occupants. Small mercy in a situation with no mercy at all. The flight instructor who'd worked with John gave an interview to the Boston Globe 2 weeks after the crash. His name was Marshall Grant, 61 years old. 43 years of teaching people to fly. He said John was one of the better students he'd trained. Took instruction seriously. Never tried to show off. Always wore his leg brace during flights, even though it made working the rudder pedals uncomfortable because he knew that discomfort was better than instability. The brace was for an ankle injury from a paragliding accident years earlier. Permanent reminder that gravity doesn't care who your father was. Marshall said something in that interview that didn't make it into the NTSB report. Said John had talked about installing an autopilot in the Piper, had gotten quotes from avionics shops, was planning to have the work done in August because he knew his limitations and knew that automation could compensate for inexperience. That's not the thinking of someone who takes unnecessary risks. That's someone who understands that flying is a game of margins, and every safety system you add widens those margins a little more. The weather data presented problems for the official narrative. The NTSB cited deteriorating visibility and loss of visual reference to the horizon. But the recorded weather at Martha's Vineyard Airport at 9 p.m. showed 10 miles visibility, clear skies, light winds. The weather observer on duty that night was a woman named Patricia Heller, 28 years with the National Weather Service. She told investigators she could see stars clearly, could see the outline of the Elizabeth Islands 7 miles away, could see aircraft landing lights from 5 miles out. Not the conditions you'd associate with spatial disorientation unless something changed very suddenly in the 12 miles between the last radio call and the crash site. Some pilots who flew that route regularly started asking questions, started looking at the flight path data. The Piper's last recorded position showed it descending normally on approach to the airport, speed and altitude consistent with landing configuration. Then nothing. No Mayday call, no radio communication. Just a plane that stopped being where it was supposed to be and started being scattered across the ocean floor in pieces. The transition from normal flight to catastrophic failure happened in less than 2 minutes, based on radar data. 2 minutes from routine to dead. Not a lot of time to fix whatever went wrong. The autopsies were performed at the medical examiner's office in Pocasset. Standard procedure for any aircraft accident with fatalities. Determine cause of death. Look for medical factors that might have contributed. Check for drugs or alcohol or anything else that could impair judgment or reaction time. The toxicology reports came back clean. John had nothing in his system. Carolyn had nothing in her system. Lauren had nothing in her system. 3 healthy people who died because a plane fell from the sky for reasons that should have been clear, but somehow weren't. The detailed autopsy results were never released to the public. The Kennedy family requested privacy. The medical examiner complied. What little information did leak suggested massive trauma consistent with high-speed impact. No evidence of incapacitation before the crash. No evidence of fire or explosion before impact. The official story held that they died when the plane hit the water. Died because a pilot without enough experience flew into conditions he couldn't handle, and paid the ultimate price for that misjudgment. But the plane itself raised questions. The Piper Saratoga had been in for maintenance 3 weeks before the accident. Annual inspection. Everything checked and signed off by a licensed A&P mechanic. Airframe hours were low for a plane that age. Engine had 800 hours since major overhaul. All the squawks in the logbook had been addressed. Control cables, fuel system, electrical system. Everything within limits. Nothing that would predict structural failure or system malfunction. The wreckage examination found no evidence of pre-impact mechanical failure. The engine had been producing power at impact. Propeller blade damage showed rotation at high RPM. Flight controls were intact with no signs of jamming or disconnection. Landing gear was retracted. Flaps were up. Everything consistent with cruise flight right up until the moment it wasn't. If something had failed mechanically, the investigators couldn't find it in the debris field. One detail that didn't get much attention in the official report: the emergency locator transmitter never activated. The ELT is designed to trigger automatically on impact, sends a distress signal on 121.5 MHz that satellites pick up and relay to rescue coordination centers. It's supposed to be foolproof, supposed to survive crashes that destroy everything else. But John's ELT stayed silent. Could have been damaged on impact. Could have been a unit failure. Could have been disabled before impact. The report noted the absence of signal but didn't speculate about why. Robert Pierce, the lead investigator, closed the case 14 months after the crash. Final report ran to 217 pages with appendices covering everything from weather data to pilot training records to metallurgical analysis of failed components. The conclusion matched the preliminary: spatial disorientation, pilot error, continued VFR flight into IMC conditions, instrument meteorological conditions, flying in clouds without the experience to trust instruments over instinct. A story as old as aviation itself. A story that explained everything if you didn't look too closely at the parts that didn't quite fit. The official story made sense if you wanted it to make sense. Inexperienced pilot, night flight, deteriorating weather, classic setup for spatial disorientation. The NTSB had statistics on their side, had decades of similar accidents, had a narrative that fit the evidence if you didn't ask too many questions about the evidence that didn't quite fit. But some people were asking questions anyway. Some people remembered that the Kennedy family had a long history of deaths that came too early and explanations that came too easy. John's father had been shot in Dallas in 1963. Official story said lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. Case closed. Except the case was never really closed. Wasn't closed for the people who saw too many coincidences. Too many witnesses who died unexpectedly. Too many pieces of evidence that disappeared or got explained away. 50 years later, people still argued about the magic bullet and the grassy knoll, and whether one man with a mail-order rifle could really pull off the crime of the century. 5 years after Dallas, John's uncle Robert got shot in Los Angeles. Different city, different gunman, same family. Same sudden violence that took a Kennedy at the exact moment when that Kennedy was about to claim real power. Robert had just won the California primary, was on track for the Democratic nomination, was likely to beat Nixon in November and become the 37th president. Then Sirhan put bullets in his head in a hotel kitchen, and that future disappeared. Official story said lone gunman again. Case closed again. Except witnesses reported more shots than Sirhan's gun could hold. Reported a girl in a polka dot dress running from the scene saying, "We shot him." Reported things that didn't make the final report. The pattern was hard to ignore if you were inclined not to ignore patterns. Kennedys who got close to power ended up dead. Kennedys who challenged the establishment ended up in graves. John's father challenged the CIA and the military-industrial complex and the mob and died in Dallas. Robert challenged the same forces and died in Los Angeles. Now John was dead in the Atlantic, and people who remembered history were wondering if this was chapter 3 of the same story. Because John wasn't just a magazine publisher playing at being a pilot, he had political ambitions, had talked about running for office. The Senate seat from New York was coming open in 2000. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was retiring. The seat was up for grabs, and John had the name and the charisma and the money to take it. More than that, he had the legacy. Had the one last name in American politics that still meant something to people who remembered Camelot and what might have been if Dallas hadn't happened. But he wasn't the only one looking at that Senate seat. Hillary Clinton was looking at it too. First Lady turned candidate, wife of the sitting president, connected to every power structure in the Democratic Party. She wanted that seat, needed that seat as a launching pad for her own presidential ambitions. And John Kennedy Jr. in a Senate race against Hillary Clinton wasn't a race Hillary could be sure of winning. The Kennedy name still had magic, still had the ability to make voters forget policy positions and vote with their hearts instead of their heads. Some people started connecting dots that maybe shouldn't be connected, started asking if John's death was convenient for people who needed him not to be a factor in the 2000 election. Started looking at the timeline and noting that John had been making calls to Democratic Party officials in New York, had been testing the waters, had been doing the preliminary work that comes before announcing a candidacy, and then his plane fell from the sky and suddenly Hillary's path to the Senate was clear, and no one with the Kennedy name was going to challenge her. The conspiracy theories came in layers. The surface layer was simple. Someone wanted John dead and made it happen. Deeper layers got more complex, involved intelligence agencies, involved political operatives, involved the same shadowy forces that supposedly killed his father and uncle. The theories ranged from plausible to paranoid, but they all shared one common thread: the belief that 3 people didn't die because a pilot got confused in the dark. A man named Terry Wallace gave an interview to a Long Island newspaper 3 weeks after the crash. Terry lived in a house near the shore. Had been outside that Friday night. Said he heard an explosion around 9:30. Not thunder, not a sonic boom. An explosion. Sharp and distinct and coming from over the water. He'd looked up but couldn't see anything in the dark. Thought maybe it was a boat. Thought maybe it was military aircraft from the base doing night exercises. Didn't think anything of it until he saw the news the next morning about John's plane. Then he thought maybe what he'd heard wasn't routine at all. The NTSB interviewed Terry as part of their investigation. His statement went into the file. The final report noted his account, classified it as inconclusive, said acoustic phenomena over water are difficult to interpret, said without corroborating evidence one witness report wasn't enough to change the probable cause determination. Terry read the report when it came out and felt like he'd been dismissed. Like what he'd heard that night mattered less than the story investigators wanted to tell. Other witnesses came forward. A couple on a boat near Martha's Vineyard said they saw a bright flash in the sky around 9:30, low on the horizon, quick and bright, and gone in a second. They'd been focused on navigating in the growing darkness, hadn't thought to report it until they heard about the search. Their account also went into the NTSB file, also got classified as inconclusive, also failed to change the official narrative about spatial disorientation and pilot error. Independent aviation experts started reviewing the case. A former Air Force pilot named Thomas Becker wrote an analysis that got passed around pilot forums online. He questioned the spatial disorientation theory, pointed out that John had instruments, had attitude indicator, had turn coordinator, had all the tools necessary to recognize and recover from unusual attitudes. Said that even a low-time pilot with basic training should be able to look at instruments and realize the plane is in a bank or descent. Said recovery is simple. Level the wings, pull back on the yoke, add power. Basic procedures drilled into every student pilot from day one. Thomas noted something else. The descent rate. The wreckage pattern suggested the plane hit the water at a steep angle going very fast. To achieve that kind of impact, you need to be descending at more than 5,000 feet per minute. You need to be in what's essentially a dive. And maintaining a dive requires continued input. Requires the pilot to keep pulling the yoke back or keep the nose down or actively prevent recovery. In a simple spatial disorientation scenario, the plane would be in an unusual attitude, but not necessarily an extreme one. Not necessarily one that would create the impact signature found at the crash site. The autopsy reports that were never fully released became another source of speculation. What were they hiding? Why couldn't the public see the full medical examiner findings? The official explanation was family privacy. The Kennedy family had suffered enough. Didn't need graphic details of their loved ones' final moments published in newspapers. That explanation satisfied most people. Didn't satisfy the ones who'd watched the Kennedy family's relationship with official investigations over the decades and noticed a pattern of information being withheld for reasons that were never entirely clear. Someone filed a Freedom of Information Act request for the full NTSB case file. Got back hundreds of pages with sections redacted. Black bars covering witness names. Black bars covering technical data. Black bars covering things that supposedly weren't relevant to the investigation, but also weren't cleared for public release. The redactions fed the conspiracy theories, gave people something concrete to point at and say, "See, they're hiding something." Whether the redactions were routine protection of personal information or evidence of a cover-up depended entirely on how much you trusted the government to tell the truth about dead Kennedys. The statistical argument carried weight, too. The Kennedy family had lost too many members to accidents and assassinations and tragedies that defied probability. John's father, Robert. John's cousin David, who died of a drug overdose. Michael, who died in a skiing accident. John himself now. You could argue that famous families get more attention, so their tragedies seem more frequent. You could argue that the Kennedy lifestyle involved risks that increased the odds of early death. Or you could argue that someone had decided a long time ago that Kennedys who got too powerful needed to be eliminated and had been working through the family tree systematically for 36 years. The truth probably sat somewhere between official explanation and conspiracy theory. Somewhere in the gray area where human error and circumstantial evidence and unanswered questions created space for doubt. John's plane probably did crash because of pilot error. But pilot error. That happened at a politically convenient time. That happened despite training and caution. That happened in a way that triggered every warning system except the one that was supposed to save lives. The official story explained what happened. Didn't entirely explain why the what happened to unfold exactly the way it did when it did. The funeral happened at sea. Thursday morning, July 22, 1999. 6 days after the crash. The Navy destroyer USS Briscoe carried the cremated remains of John and Carolyn and Lauren 17 miles off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. The Kennedy family stood on deck under gray skies while a chaplain said prayers and the ashes were committed to the Atlantic. No media, no public ceremony, just family and ocean and the finality of bodies returned to water. It was the end the Kennedy family chose. Private, dignified, final in a way that left no grave for conspiracy theorists to visit, no headstone to become a pilgrimage site. John's father was buried at Arlington with an eternal flame. Robert was buried nearby. John would have no marker, would exist only in memory and photographs and the questions that would follow his death for decades. The magazine John founded kept publishing for 2 more years. George Magazine, Politics as Lifestyle, Entertainment as Politics. It had been his attempt to make civic engagement accessible to people who didn't read policy journals, had been moderately successful, but never quite found its financial footing. Without John's name and face on the masthead, it lost whatever magic had kept investors interested. The final issue came out in 2001. The staff scattered to other publications. The archives got boxed up and stored. Another what might have been added to the list of Kennedy what might have beens. Hillary Clinton won the New York Senate seat in 2000, ran against Rick Lazio, won by 12 points, went on to serve 8 years before running for president herself. Whether John would have challenged her remained speculation. Whether he would have won remained unknowable. The political future he might have had died with him in the Atlantic, and history moved forward along a path that didn't include another Kennedy in the Senate. The NTSB case file stayed closed for 25 years. Standard procedure for accident investigations. After a quarter century, the files get reviewed for declassification. Some documents get released. Some stay sealed. Depends on what's in them. Depends on whether releasing them serves the public interest or compromises ongoing investigations or violates privacy rights that extend beyond death. The Kennedy crash file came up for review in 2024. Most of it got released. Some sections stayed redacted. The redacted sections fed new rounds of speculation online about what information was still being protected and why. Aviation safety improved because of the crash. The FAA issued new guidance on night VFR flight over water. Recommended additional training for pilots transitioning to complex aircraft. Recommended autopilot systems for single-pilot operations. The recommendations were voluntary, didn't have the force of regulation, but flight schools started incorporating them. Insurance companies started requiring them. The industry learned from John's death even if the lesson came too late to save him. The conspiracy theories never died. Got new life with each anniversary. Got recycled on internet forums where people who weren't born in 1999 debated what really happened that night. Some theories got more elaborate over time. Involved remote control technology. Involved electromagnetic weapons. Involved scenarios that required sophistication and coordination that bordered on impossible. Other theories stayed simple. Someone planted a bomb and timing was everything and John died because he was a Kennedy who wanted power. No smoking gun ever emerged. No deathbed confession from a CIA operative. No leaked documents proving sabotage. No whistleblower coming forward with evidence that would reopen the investigation. Just the persistent gap between what the official report said and what some people believed must have happened. The gap that exists in any high-profile death where the deceased had enemies and the circumstances had coincidences, and the explanation required accepting that sometimes bad luck is just bad luck. 25 years later, the wreckage still sits on the ocean floor. The NTSB recovered the major components for investigation, left the small pieces scattered across the debris field. Eventually, the aluminum will corrode. The seats will rot. The instruments will fill with sediment. In 100 years, there will be nothing left but shadows in the sand that might have been an airplane once. Physical evidence erased by time and salt water. Only the questions will remain. What we know for certain is this: 3 people got into a plane on Friday night in July. 3 people who had plans and futures, and people who loved them. They flew into darkness over water. They never arrived at their destination. They died when the plane hit the ocean at high speed. Everything else is interpretation. Everything else depends on whether you believe accidents are just accidents, or whether you believe powerful people eliminate threats and cover their tracks. The Kennedy name still carries weight in American politics, still opens doors and draws crowds, and makes people remember a time when the country felt young and optimistic, and anything seemed possible. But the family that carried that name paid a price for the privilege. Paid in lives cut short. Paid in funerals attended too young. Paid in the burden of living up to a legacy built on tragedy, as much as triumph. John was the last Kennedy of his generation who might have reached the presidency, had the name, had the looks, had enough of his father's charisma to make people believe he could be something special. Whether he would have been something special is a question history will never answer. Whether he was killed to prevent him from trying is a question that depends on how much faith you have in official explanations and how much weight you give to patterns that might be coincidence or might be something darker. The ocean keeps its secrets. The government keeps its files. The family keeps its grief private. And everyone else is left to decide what they believe about a plane crash that killed 3 people on a summer night 25 years ago. Some will accept the NTSB report and move on. Some will spend decades looking for evidence of conspiracy that may or may not exist. Both groups will be certain they're right. Neither will be able to prove it absolutely. What remains is memory. John as a 3-year-old boy saluting his father's coffin. John as a young man trying to build a life separate from the family legacy. John as a pilot who loved flying despite the risks. John as a husband who died beside his wife. John as the Prince of Camelot who never got the chance to become king. The life he lived matters more than the theories about his death, but the theories persist because the Kennedy story has never been just about facts. It's been about what America believes about power and corruption, and whether the people who threaten the system get eliminated before they can change it. The truth is probably simpler than conspiracy and more complicated than accident. The truth is probably that John made a judgment call that night, decided the weather was good enough, decided his skills were sufficient, decided the risk was acceptable, and the universe proved him wrong in the most permanent way possible. No malice required. No grand conspiracy needed. Just physics and human limitation and the ocean waiting below. But simple truths don't satisfy everyone. Don't satisfy people who've watched the Kennedy family bleed for 3 generations. Don't satisfy people who've learned not to trust official explanations about dead Kennedys. So the questions persist. The theories multiply. The debate continues. And somewhere in the Atlantic, 120 feet down, the last fragments of a Piper Saratoga sit in the sand, holding whatever secrets went down with them, silent witnesses to a death that America still hasn't finished arguing about.